What would you pay for power? Gold, blood, or something far more personal, something pulled from your own body, proof of your existence carved out one by one? In 1854 Vermont, 4 sisters answered that question, and their answer was not coin, not property, not scripture. Their answer was teeth. Imagine a winter night, the valley frozen beneath silence, the steeple bells muffled under snow, families asleep in timber homes warmed by stoves, and somewhere beyond the edge of town, a single lamp burning in a farmhouse no longer on any map. Inside, 4 young women hunched over a ledger, line after line, neat handwriting, the kind only taught in schools where discipline meant silence, and on each line, a name. Beside it, not a sum of dollars, not a tally of livestock, but the count of teeth taken, some marked as gifts, others clearly payments, and more than a few marked with initials belonging to villagers who, in that same year, died suddenly, inexplicably, with mouths closed tight. The ledger survived the fire that consumed their home, though edges were blackened, words blurred by smoke, but enough remained, enough to terrify. Those who handled it afterward whispered of a stench that lingered on their hands like iron and earth. Curators at small museums refused to catalogue it. Historians avoided writing of it. Even private collectors, who proudly displayed human remains from battlefields and relics from executions, shuddered and hid the book away. Why? Because it spoke of a currency no institution dares admit exists. Neighbors recalled the sisters never singing hymns. When asked why, they answered as one, "Our voices are already taken." What does that mean? Already taken by whom? Or by what? They moved through the village together, never apart, their eyes lowered, their speech measured. Yet when a neighbor's cow died, when a child was buried, when a toothless body, as lowered into frozen earth, the sisters' farmhouse light burned deep into the night. To dismiss this as rural superstition is easy, but superstition does not explain multiple graves with jaws stripped clean. Superstition does not explain why death records from that decade were altered, rewritten, or vanished from county archives. Superstition does not account for a book of names and teeth, half-burned, yet undeniable. We are told history is progress, that the past was primitive, innocent, naive, but history is a veil, and behind that veil is an economy more ancient than banks, more enduring than kings, an economy of flesh. Teeth resist decay. They outlast bone, skin, even stone. To trade in teeth is to trade in permanence, to keep proof when bodies rot. So what did the sisters serve? Who demanded these offerings? What ledger did they keep, hidden behind the one they wrote with their hands? And why has the book resurfaced again and again before being pulled back into the shadows? You were never meant to hear this story. Vermont's snow was supposed to cover it forever, but now you know the ledger exists, and once you know, you cannot unknow. Before we descend further, tell me, what state are you watching from? Every land has its own hidden ledger, its own sisters buried in silence. Write your state in the comments and subscribe, because the next revelation will show you just how deep the debt runs. To understand the ledger, we must return to the house itself. The farmhouse where the 4 sisters lived was older than the town around it, built before county records began, on land first cleared by settlers who vanished without descendants. Its foundation was laid with stone dragged from a riverbed where indigenous people once left offerings. Even before the sisters were born, the house was whispered about as unlucky ground. Their father, Elias, was a merchant who never seemed to prosper, though he always kept his accounts balanced. He sold grain, timber, and livestock, yet his neighbors noticed he never carried coin. They said he paid debts with something small and wrapped in cloth, something his creditors never spoke about aloud. Their mother, Margaret, taught school, but her lessons were strange. Children recalled that she made them copy prayers in silence, never aloud. She told them voices could be stolen, and once taken, they never returned. And then came the daughters, 4 girls in 4 consecutive years, each pale, each solemn, each sharing the same features as though they were copies of a single face. The midwives who delivered them claimed the births were too easy, unnaturally so. and when the last daughter came, the midwife refused to stay in the house another night, muttering that no woman should birth shadows of herself. From the beginning, the sisters moved as one. They answered questions in unison, finished each other's sentences, and were never seen apart. Farmers in the village began to call them the choir that would not sing. Their presence at market made men uneasy. Their silence in church was heavier than any sermon. When one sister's arm was cut by a scythe, all four were seen nursing the same wound, wincing as though they shared the pain. But the ledger, the teeth, was not theirs at first. It belonged to Elias, the father. Hidden in a locked chest, the book was rumored to contain every debt he ever collected. After his sudden death, collapsed in the field, mouth agape, his jaw curiously bare of teeth, the book passed into the hands of his daughters. And from that day, the entries multiplied at a furious pace. Neighbors died, children were buried without explanation, and the book grew heavier. Was it accounting? Was it ritual? Or was it both? Each tooth was written into the ledger with precision, each name marked not as lost, but as paid. Paid to whom? That question haunts every attempt to explain the sisters. If they were insane, then why did records vanish from the county archives? Why did ministers refuse to preach their funerals? Why did officials burn the farmhouse after the fire, ensuring no stone could be salvaged? The sisters themselves left no testimony. They vanished on the same night the house burned, bodies never recovered, graves never dug. Only the ledger remained. When you think of history, you are taught of wars, elections, and inventions, but history also consists of what was deliberately removed, torn from books, hidden from ledgers. The four sisters remind us that there are families who never measured wealth in fields or barns, but in what endured beyond flesh. And if a family could build its fortune in teeth, what else has been measured in silence, while you were told it was progress? When we look at the history of small towns, we assume records are reliable. Births, marriages, deaths, land deeds, all carefully archived, preserved in dusty ledgers in county offices. But when it comes to the four sisters of Vermont, something strange happens. The paper trail frays, then vanishes entirely, as if an invisible hand reached back into time and erased them. The first disappearances were subtle. A baptism record missing from the parish registry, a census with 4 fewer names than lived in the farmhouse, a line in a school roll book carefully crossed out, rewritten with another child's name. At first, villagers thought these were clerical errors, the kind of mistakes common in rural life. But then, whole sections of records disappeared. Years of county death logs burned in an office fire. Marriage licenses torn from books. And the minister who claimed to have buried 2 of the sisters died suddenly, leaving no sermon notes, no journal entries, no trace. It is almost as if every time the 4 sisters came close to being written into official memory, the ink was pulled back into silence. The church was the first to look away. Ministers knew of the ledger. Some had seen it with their own eyes, yet none spoke of it in sermons. Why? Because the ledger contained names from their own congregations. Parishioners who donated, sang, took communion. To admit that their teeth had been taken, that their deaths had been tallied, would have shattered the illusion of sanctity. Better to call it rumor, better to blame fever, accident, or fate. The state behaved no differently. County officials noted inconsistencies, empty graves, altered wills, tax rolls that listed property owners who had already been buried, yet none pursued an inquiry. The sisters lived untouched, protected by silence, as though some higher order had decided their work must not be disturbed, and, when the farmhouse burned, officials declared the ruins unfit for salvage, ordering the stones scattered and the land left fallow. No investigation, no trial, no closure, just absence. Why this protection? Why this silence? Because history is not just what is remembered, it is also what is deliberately erased, and sometimes the act of erasure is the loudest truth of all. Think of it, a community watching its children buried without teeth, its records vanish into fire, its church windows closed to keep out whispers, and yet no revolt, no uprising, no mob storming the sisters' house. Fear alone does not explain it. Fear silences individuals. but for an entire system, church, state, and community, to cooperate in silence, something else was at work. Something older, something that promised order in exchange for obedience. And this is where the story turns darker still. Because once you see the pattern, once you realize the sisters were not resisted but shielded, you begin to wonder how many other families in how many other towns have been erased the same way. How many ledgers, how many offerings were absorbed quietly into the machinery of history until no one dared speak their names aloud. The sisters did not just keep a ledger of teeth. They taught us that history itself is a ledger, one that pays out in silence. And if silence is the currency, then what has been purchased with your silence and mine? Ask yourself this. Why teeth? Why not blood? Why not bone? Why not the endless other offerings that desperate families across the centuries have given to gods, saints, or shadows? Why would 4 sisters in 1854 Vermont record teeth as though they were coins of the realm? The answer is not simple. Teeth are permanence. They survive fire, famine, centuries underground. Long after the skin collapses, after the organs return to dust, after even bone crumbles, teeth remain. They are the most enduring fragment of the body, a proof that a life once existed. To hold a tooth is to hold what refuses to die. But the ledger was not a collector's cabinet. These entries were not trophies, they were transactions. Every tooth bore a name, an initial, sometimes even a date. This was not hoarding, this was exchange. And in every society that has trafficked in ritual, an exchange means a bargain, something given in return for something else. So what were the sisters buying? Neighbors whispered that their farm was never touched by blight, that their animals never sickened, that storms seemed to part around their fields. Even when winter starved the valley, the sisters' stores were full. Some said they were favored by fortune. Others muttered that no fortune comes without payment. And then the graves began to multiply. It is here that we must confront the possibility that the ledger was a covenant. Not with banks, not with law, but with forces that thrived on permanence, on proof. Each tooth recorded was an offering, a signature of the dead, binding them to whatever contract the sisters had inherited from their father. Think carefully about this. If the sisters' silence in church was defiance, if their refusal to sing was more than stubbornness, then perhaps it was obedience to another liturgy, one that required no hymns, only teeth. When they said, "Our voices are already taken," were they confessing a debt paid in advance? Or were they warning the town that the choir they served was not of flesh and blood? The minister who claimed to glimpse the ledger before his sudden death described the pages as shining with something that was not ink. Imagine that. A man of God, trained to dismiss superstition, shaken to the point of secrecy because what he saw glimmered in the dark. The ink was not ink. The names did not fade. And the teeth, the very count of them, seemed to weigh down the paper as if the book itself hungered. No institution dared confront this because institutions themselves thrive on contracts. The state trades silence for order. The church trades obedience for salvation. And what if the sisters had found a contract older, stronger, beyond the reach of scripture or law? A covenant sealed in enamel and permanence, one ledger that could outlast fire, outlast erasure, outlast death itself. This is where the line between history and ritual collapses. Because if the sisters' ledger was a covenant, then the question we must ask is not why did they keep it, but who still holds it now? Not everything can be erased. Paper records may burn, ledgers may vanish, ministers may fall silent, but the human mouth cannot stop whispering, and in the decades after 1854, the whispers of those who remembered the 4 sisters spread like smoke through Vermont's valleys. Some claimed they saw candlelight flickering through the sisters' windows long past midnight, though no firewood was ever carried inside. Others swore they heard low voices chanting, not in English, not in Latin, but in a cadence that bent the air itself, a sound that seemed to burrow under the skin. A farmer's wife said she woke to find her child standing outside the sisters' door at 3 a.m, barefoot in the snow, teeth chattering, eyes wide, unable to remember how she had walked there. And always it came back to the teeth. One mason, working on a neighbor's barn, spoke of a bag of teeth he found buried under a stone near the sisters' field. He described them as warm to the touch, though the earth around them was frozen. He told his wife. By the next day, the bag had vanished, the ground resealed as though no spade had touched it. The mason never spoke of it again, except once, years later, when he confessed to a friend that the bag had made a sound, the faint rattle of voices, when he first opened it. There was also the schoolteacher, who had once been Margaret's pupil. She recalled being punished for speaking aloud in class. "Voices," Margaret had said, "are not yours to keep." When that teacher, grown into an old woman, was asked what she believed the four sisters were doing with the ledger, she replied only, "They were feeding it." Perhaps the most haunting testimony came from a boy, 12 years old, who worked as a hired hand near the sisters' farm. He swore he saw them standing in a circle in the barn one night, their heads bent low, their hands linked. In the center woe, as the ledger, open wide, he claimed he saw teeth moving on the page, as if trying to bury themselves into the parchment. He ran. His family sent him away the next week, and he was never seen in that village again. Were these lies, delusions, exaggerations from frightened people? Maybe. But ask yourself, why did these whispers remain even when every record was destroyed? Why did people cling to these memories if they were only inventions? Because the human body remembers fear. It etches terror into the marrow, and even when facts are erased, fear endures as testimony. And still, there was silence. No mob stormed the farmhouse, no vigilantes rose to end the sisters' work. Because deep down, the villagers knew the truth. The sisters were not breaking order, they were part of it. Their ledger was a contract that stretched beyond their walls, beyond their fields, beyond Vermont itself. And here lies the deeper horror. What if the villagers were not victims at all, but participants? What if every whispered story, every candle seen in the night, every missing tooth was part of a bargain the entire community accepted, even if it meant burying their dead incomplete? The ledger was not hidden from them, it was hidden through them. Fear explains nothing by itself. Fear can make a person tremble, hide, pray. But fear alone does not make entire communities go mute for generations. Fear does not erase records. Fear does not protect those who should be condemned. No, fear, when harnessed, becomes something more powerful, obedience, and obedience, when carried long enough, begins to look like faith. The people of that Vermont valley lived in the shadow of the four sisters, but they did not resist them. They adjusted. They married their children, buried their dead, harvested their fields, while quietly stepping around the sisters' farmhouse as if it were a natural boundary. To walk past their windows at night was a dare. To speak their names too loudly was a mistake. People did not merely avoid them, they participated in the silence that kept them untouchable. Think about that. Mothers who found their children's mouths missing teeth but never demanded justice, fathers who buried kin without questioning, ministers who knew their parishioners vanished from records but still rang the church bell each Sunday as though nothing was missing. That is not fear, that is complicity. That is a bargain struck not only by the sisters but by the entire village, a pact that said, if we do not speak of it, if we obey the silence, then perhaps the debt will pass us by. Silence became the tax they paid for survival. And once silence becomes a tax, it becomes tradition. Children grow up learning what not to say. They inherit caution in their bones. They learn to lower their voices, to keep secrets, to live as if truth itself is poisonous. And when those children become adults, they do not break the chain. They pass it on. This is why generations later, when outsiders asked about the burned farmhouse, descendants would shrug, change the subject, or speak vaguely about unlucky ground. They weren't only hiding me. They were obeying a rhythm older than themselves. They were still paying. Do you see what I'm showing you? The ledger was not just a book of teeth. The ledger was a system, an accounting of silence that reached beyond parchment. 4 young women may have held the quill, but the entire village held the debt. Every look away, every hushed whisper, every burial without protest was another line written in invisible ink. And if that ledger taught us anything, it is this: when silence becomes inherited, it becomes culture. And when culture is built on silence, corruption becomes invisible. You live inside the bargain without even knowing its terms. The Four Sisters may be gone, but what they taught that valley endures everywhere. Look at your own community. Look at your institutions. How many things are whispered about, but never spoken of? How many truths are swallowed whole, dressed as superstition, hidden in plain sight? That is not coincidence. That is design. Remember, silence is never empty. It is always purchased. Teeth are more than bone. They are not scraps of skeleton left behind by accident. They are identity. Every smile is a signature. Every jaw, a map. For centuries across cultures, teeth have been seen as proof of self, talismans of power, fragments of the soul encased in enamel. To take a tooth is not to mutilate, it is to possess. It is to steal permanence. The Four Sisters understood this, or rather, they inherited the understanding. Their father's ledger taught them that the tooth was the ultimate token, the ultimate guarantee that the dead could not rise against you, that the living could never quite free themselves from your grip. To record a tooth was to record not just death, but ownership. And think of the whispers that survived. Neighbors describing the sisters' refusal to sing, their confession that our voices are already taken. What does that mean unless teeth themselves were the tether? Strip a body of its teeth, and you strip it of its voice. Remove the enamel, and you silence its song. Every tooth in that ledger was a stolen voice, a stolen prayer, a stolen testimony that would never be spoken. The ledger was not merely a record. It was a prison, a binding of voices into silence. Each page whispered with the names of the lost because their voices had been locked there forever, buried under neat handwriting and the weight of enamel. That is why the minister who glimpsed it swore the ink glimmered in the dark, because it was not ink. It was residue. Residue of all the voices pressed into parchment, screaming without sound. Is it coincidence that those whose teeth were taken died in agony, their mouths clenched, their jaws stiff? Is it chance that families buried their dead quickly, tightly, almost in fear the corpse might try to speak again? No, these were not accidents. They were the result of ritual theft, the deliberate silencing of a community, so that no witness, no testimony, no protest could survive. This is why even the survivors kept quiet. They had lost their teeth, they had lost their voices, and without voice, there is no resistance. Understand what I'm telling you. The ledger was not about collecting remains, it was about harvesting silence, a system of control dressed as mystery, an accounting that did not measure wealth in coin, but in how many voices could be erased from history. And here is the chilling truth. When voices vanish, power grows. The sisters' silence was not weakness. It was their weapon. By refusing to sing, by speaking as one, they displayed their allegiance, not to the church, not to the town, but to the economy of silence itself. Which brings us to the greater question: if the ledger was filled with stolen voices, whose voice did it serve? What if the ledger was never meant to be read by human eyes at all? What if every entry, every name paired with a tooth was not written for us, but for something else? A recipient beyond flesh, beyond the reach of church or state. Think of how the book resisted destruction. The farmhouse burned, but the ledger remained, half charred but intact. Museums refused to catalogue it, curators returned it in fear. Private collectors whispered of sleepless nights when they dared open its cover. A book that survives fire and terrifies even the shameless. That is not just paper. That is a vessel. Villagers who glimpsed the sisters at work described them not as writing, but as listening. They sat in silence, heads bent low, as if waiting for instructions whispered from the page. What kind of ledger gives orders? What kind of record keeper takes dictation from the dead? Unless, of course, the book was more than record. It was a mouth. Silence itself can be a voice. Absence itself can speak. You know this in your bones. The long pause before bad news, the stillness after a scream, the empty pew in a church where someone should be. That silence is not void, it is presence. The ledger amplified that presence. It was a device built to channel what human ears were never meant to hear. Some accounts say that on winter nights, the sisters could be seen around the open ledger, not chanting, not singing, but swaying gently, their eyes closed, their lips parted. Neighbors swore they heard no sound. And yet animals shivered, dogs barked, the air grew heavy. Imagine that, a ritual without sound, a mass celebrated in silence, but silence amplified by 4 young women offering teeth as proof, as tokens, as currency. This is why the villagers obeyed. They did not fear the sisters alone. They feared what spoke through them. They feared the silence that pressed against their walls when the sisters turned their faces toward the village. Silence that was not empty but full of the names already recorded, full of the teeth already paid. If the church ignored it, if the state erased it, if generations fell mute before it, perhaps it is because they recognized something older than scripture, older than law, a system that did not need armies or cathedrals, only silence and proof, teeth as receipts, the ledger as the archive. And here is where the conspiracy grows darker. Because if the ledger was conduit, then the sisters were not authors, they were custodians. They did not write the book. They kept it. They did not invent the ritual, they inherited it. Which means somewhere, someone gave them the book. And somewhere still, someone, or something, waited for it to be filled. Ask yourself, who benefits from a silence so complete it swallows history? Who feeds on voices that never reach heaven, that never reach the ears of the living? Who demanded payment in teeth, and why? Perhaps the ledger was not their creation. Perhaps it was their offering to the order that birthed them. The night of the fire was remembered differently by every witness, and that, in itself, is telling. For some, the farmhouse burned in silence, flames leaping high but making no crackle, no roar, only the soft sound of air being drawn inward, as if the blaze were breathing. For others, the sound was unbearable, a chorus of shrieks carried across the valley, though no human voices were seen in the flames. And still others swore the house did not burn from the outside in, but from the inside out, light pouring from the windows long before the roof collapsed. What all agreed upon was this: when the smoke cleared, the 4 sisters were gone. No bodies, no bones, no remains, a house reduced to ash, but no corpses within it. And in the rubble, buried under a stone blackened by heat, was the ledger. Charred along its edges, yes, but intact. Pages legible, names still visible, teeth still pressed into parchment like coins in wax. Tell me, how does fire consume every beam of timber, every nail, every chair, every body, and yet leave a book alive? Unless the fire itself was not destruction, but passage. Unless the house did not burn to erase the sisters, but to deliver them, somewhere the ledger itself was designed to preserve. The officials who arrived the next morning made quick work of the scene. No inquiry, no search for missing women, no questions about cause. They declared the ruins unsafe, ordered the stones scattered, forbade the land to be tilled. The neighbors did not argue. The church held no funerals. The silence was absolute, as if the fire had fulfilled the contract, and all that was left was compliance. But whispers endured. One farmer swore he saw 4 figures walking the ridge above the smoldering ruins, their dresses unburned, their faces pale against the sky. Another claimed he found footprints in the snow days later, barefoot, small, 4 sets lead in bounds, into the forest, but never coming out. A child said she dreamed of them standing at her bedside, holding the ledger open, their mouths full of teeth that were not their own. The ledger itself passed quickly into shadow. Some say it was taken by the minister who had once seen it glow, who locked it in the church crypt before vanishing himself. Others say county officials carried it away in silence, delivering it to men from Boston who arrived with covered wagons, and a few whisper that the ledger never left the valley at all, that it still rests beneath the frozen soil where the farmhouse once stood, waiting for hands willing to touch it again. Understand this, the fire was not an ending, it was a veil. The sisters did not perish, they were absorbed into the silence they had served. The house was not destroyed, it was erased, wiped from maps, consumed from history, and the ledger survived not as accident but as proof that contracts written in teeth cannot be undone by flame. So ask yourself, if the fire was passage, then where did the sisters go? And if the ledger still exists, who keeps writing in it now? The disappearance of the four sisters in 1854 might be dismissed as a singular tragedy, an isolated rural mystery, if not for one chilling pattern. It was not the only time. Across America, in the same decades, whole households, whole communities were erased by fire, leaving nothing but rumors and silence. Consider 1837 in western Pennsylvania. A farmhouse blaze consumed a family of 6. No bodies were found, but in the ashes was a single book, its pages smeared with what appeared to be blood, though it did not fade. The local sheriff recorded the event only for the file to disappear a year later, or look to 1862 in Tennessee, when an orphanage caught fire during a storm. Witnesses swore they saw children standing in the windows, not screaming, only staring, their mouths strangely dark. The building collapsed, no bodies recovered, yet afterward, small bags of teeth were found in the fields. Over and over, across different states, the same uncanny echo. Fire with no remains, silence where screams should be, artifacts that resisted destruction. Vermont was not an anomaly. It was part of a chain. And here is where the story deepens into conspiracy. When these events occurred, local officials always acted the same. Quick declarations, no investigations. Survivors hushed, records altered, properties deemed unfit for rebuilding. How is it that from Pennsylvania to Tennessee to Vermont, the machinery of erasure moved the same way? Unless there was coordination, unless there was an understanding, unspoken but binding, that certain events must be swallowed whole. Think about it. The mid-19th century was a period of upheaval, wars loomed, industry grew, America was inventing its identity, but what if beneath that official history, another history was unfolding, one that traded in silence, one that harvested permanence? The four sisters were not alone. They were a visible thread of a wider fabric, a fabric woven by families who kept ledgers not of coin, but of teeth. Some researchers have noticed another pattern, the census records. Entire family lines vanish between one decade and the next, not because of migration, not because of war, but because they simply dissolve from the page. Families erased, their names missing, their legacies gone. Where do they go? Into silence, into the same system the sisters served. And then there are the institutions. Why did the church always look away? Why did the state always erase? Perhaps because they recognized the value. Silence maintains order. Fear ensures obedience. What better way to secure control than to allow families like the sisters to do the work of erasure, then to sweep the ashes under official rugs? We are not looking at coincidence. We are looking at a network of ledgers, of offerings, of fires that burned not to destroy but to conceal, a network of voices bound into silence, their teeth the receipts of transactions too dangerous to acknowledge. The four sisters were not an ending, they were a chapter, and if other chapters remain unread, ask yourself, how many ledgers are still hidden? How many fires will it take before the pattern is undeniable? Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. History itself begins to look like a book written not in ink but in ash and enamel. When you trace the pattern of silence far enough, you stop finding accidents and start finding architecture, rural tragedies, unexplained fires, missing families. They do not drift at random across the map. They orbit power. They follow the lines of influence, church councils, courthouse archives, fraternal halls where men swore loyalty in candlelit rooms. The Four Sisters of Vermont did not survive by chance. They were protected. Ask why the church ignored them. Ask why the state erased them. Then ask who benefits when voices are stolen and silence becomes law. By the 1850s, New England was not only a landscape of farms and villages, it was a breeding ground for secret societies, fraternal orders, benevolent clubs that were anything but benevolent. Town lodges sprouted like weeds, each claiming ritual, each swearing oaths. And behind their closed doors, they exchanged knowledge too dangerous for daylight. Some whispered of symbols carved into bone, of contracts older than the Republic itself. In this world, the sisters' ledger was not a horror to be destroyed. It was a tool to be preserved. It represented a proof that silence could be harvested, recorded, and weaponized. That communities could be bound not by law, but by absence. To men who thrived on control, this was not nightmare. This was blueprint. Look closely at the aftermath of the fire. County officials arrived with unusual speed. Land records were altered within days. And then, men from Boston, men no one in the valley had ever seen before. They arrived with wagons covered in tarpaulin, spoke to no one, carried nothing out that anyone could recognize. Yet within weeks, references to the sisters had been stripped from public record. Their names gone. Their land declared barren. The ledger vanished. Boston in that decade was a hive of fraternal power. Merchant guilds, Masonic halls, banking families, all interconnected, all speaking in symbols the public never learned to decipher. And here, in the quiet ashes of a farmhouse, lay an artifact that proved silence itself could be a currency. Do you think they would leave it behind? Understand this. The sisters may have served something older, but human hands recognized its usefulness. Institutions do not destroy what they can weaponize. Churches preach silence when silence secures obedience. States erase records when records threaten order. Fraternal orders collect artifacts that can bind men tighter than loyalty alone. The ledger was more than a book. It was a manual, a demonstration. And those who took it from the farmhouse likely studied it, replicated it, incorporated it into their own rights of control. Which means the Four Sisters were not only keeping silence for themselves, they were teaching the world how to do it. This is the turning point. Once you see that the sisters were not isolated witches or cursed children, but part of a larger system, the whole story changes. They were not just monsters, they were evidence of a mechanism that has shaped institutions for centuries. And ask yourself, if the ledger was preserved, who is writing in it now? What names are being erased in silence today, while you are told history is progress? Silence has always been the strongest chain. It requires no prisons, no guards, no visible walls. It works from within. It teaches people to look away, to swallow their questions, to bury their instincts. And once silence becomes habit, it no longer feels like obedience. It feels like normal life. The Four Sisters knew this. Their ledger was not just about teeth, it was about voices, proof of who could speak and proof of who never would again. By removing the tooth, they removed the testimony. By recording it in ink that glimmered, they converted silence into permanence. Each entry said, "This voice is mine, this silence belongs to me." Now consider how silence works today. No ledger of teeth, no farmhouse glowing on the horizon, but the machinery is the same. Voices vanish not by fire, but by erasure. Records disappear not by ash, but by algorithms. Memory itself is silenced, rewritten, pushed under until no one remembers what was spoken at all. You live in the same system. It has only changed its tools. Think about the archives of your own time. Censored books, removed posts, voices that shout one day and vanish the next. Does it not echo the parish ledgers stripped of names, the census pages missing families, the funerals without teeth? Different century, same economy. The four sisters showed the blueprint, and power adapted. They proved that silence is the most reliable currency. And here is the cruelest truth. Silence does not just punish, it reshapes. Those who remain alive learn to adapt. They raise children who already know what not to say. They bury questions before they are spoken. They adjust their memory until forgetting feels safer than truth. This is how a valley in Vermont lived in complicity. This is how entire nations do the same today. The sisters' neighbors were not fools. They knew something was wrong. They saw graves that did not match death records. They felt the chill when voices stopped mid-sentence, but survival teaches compromise, and so they obeyed. They chose silence, and silence, once chosen, spreads like a contagion. Now pause and reflect. What are you silent about today? What do you avoid mentioning in front of family, neighbors, employers? What truths sit like teeth beneath the soil of your own life, never dug up, never spoken aloud? That is the ledger continuing its work, not in Vermont, not in 1854, but here, now, in you. The sisters proved a terrifying lesson. You do not need chains to control people. You only need to convince them that silence keeps them safe. Once they believe that, they will guard their own prison. And here is where you, the listener, must decide. Will you keep paying into that ledger with your silence, or will you break the chain? What if silence was never the end? What if it was the offering itself, fuel for something older than any church bell, something that still feeds on every voice withheld, every truth buried? The ledger of the four sisters was not empty paper. It carried weight, a presence. Those who touched it said the pages felt damp, as though they had absorbed breath itself. Some swore they heard faint sounds when they closed the book, not screams, not whispers, but a pressure in the ear, like standing too close to the ocean, a tide that pulls you in. That is not record-keeping, that is hunger. Think of the villagers who buried their children without teeth. The sisters marked each one carefully, as if logging deposits into a bank. Deposits of silence, deposits of life. But for what account? Whose balance was being filled? Ancient traditions across the world speak of silence as a doorway. Monks in remote monasteries who believe unbroken quiet allows other realms to bleed through. Shamans who describe silence as the truest sacrifice, harder to offer than blood, because it starves the soul itself. The sisters were not inventing, they were inheriting, they were enacting a ritual that transcended geography. When they said, "Our voices are already taken," perhaps they weren't speaking metaphorically. Perhaps their voices truly had been claimed, bound, absorbed into the ledger that fed something vast and voiceless, something that still listens, and each new tooth recorded, each new silence sealed, was another meal, another morsel for the thing beyond. Do you understand the implication? If silence is currency, then the ledger was not banking it, it was spending it. It was paying something back, something that demanded proof, demanded permanence, and teeth, indestructible teeth, were the receipts. The fire that consumed the farmhouse did not destroy this hunger. Fire is purification, but also passage. What if the sisters walked willingly into flame, not as victims, but as vessels? What if their absence was the completion of a contract? Bodies burned, voices surrendered, ledger left behind as proof of fulfillment. Now look at history after 1854. More fires, more vanishings, more communities that erased their own dead. Do you think it ended with the four sisters? Or did the ledger, and whatever fed from it, simply move hosts? Even today, silence surrounds the story. Academics dismiss it. Families refuse to speak of it. And yet, whispers remain. Whispers that the ledger has surfaced in private collections, glowing faintly under candlelight, pages still heavy with names. Whispers that new entries appeared long after 1854, in handwriting no one recognizes. Which leaves us with one question that cuts deeper than all others. If silence is still being harvested, if teeth are still being tallied somewhere in hidden ledgers, what is being fed? And when will it be full? What if I told you the ledger has never stopped? that every silence you have kept, every word you swallowed, every truth you buried to keep yourself safe, each was another line written, another tooth paid. The four sisters did not invent the system, they revealed it, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Silence is the coin, obedience the contract, permanence the proof. In 1854 it was teeth. Today it is every time you say nothing when you should speak, every time you look away when something feels wrong, every time you allow the record to be erased because resisting feels too dangerous. You may think this is superstition, rural horror, old folklore, but tell me, how many voices today vanish overnight? How many people are silenced, not by fire, but by invisible hands that erase their words from the record? How many neighbors pretend not to notice? Do you see? The ledger has only changed its language. The teeth are digital now, but the silence is the same. And here is the truth no one tells you. The ledger does not wait for consent. The sisters' neighbors did not choose. They adjusted, obeyed, paid their silence like tax. And so do you. Every time you let fear stop you, every time you believe the lie that keeping quiet will keep you safe. So, ask yourself, if the ledger demanded proof from you today, what would it take first? Your voice, your memory, your name. Whose silence would be traded in your place? Because the ledger always collects, and it collects from those who never believe they are part of it. Halfway through this journey, I want you to do something dangerous, something symbolic. Write this phrase in the comments, twice. I will not feed the ledger. Do you understand why? Because words spoken break silence, because a voice raised, even in symbolic defiance, interrupts the contract. Rituals demand participation, and refusing to participate is the only true rebellion. The villagers of Vermont never spoke. They let the ledger grow fat with their silence. But you do not have to. You can expose what silence feeds. You can resist the inheritance, because if history has taught us anything, it is that silence purchased is never silence kept. It is silence stolen, converted, weaponized against you. The sisters knew this. That is why they did not sing in church. Their voices had been claimed, but yours has not yet, unless you give it away. So write it now, twice. Let the algorithm itself record your defiance. Let the very system designed to erase voices become the place where yours is written, not as payment, not as silence, but as proof that the ledger does not own you. Because if you say nothing, the book writes your name anyway. The ledger did not die in the ashes of that farmhouse. It lived on, not just in parchment and enamel, but in bloodlines. Silence itself became hereditary. Families carried it forward without realizing what they had inherited, shaping entire generations around the absence of what could not be spoken. Consider how the villagers behaved after 1854. They never rebuilt the land. They taught their children not to ask. They handed down stories stripped of detail, warnings wrapped in vagueness, and as those children became parents, they passed on the silence as if it were wisdom. Don't go near that ridge. Don't speak of the sisters. Don't question what you cannot change. These phrases became mantras, lullabies, the rhythms of daily life. Silence as a cradle song. Silence as discipline. Silence as faith. Over decades, that silence calcified. Descendants left the valley, married into new families, built new homes, but the habits remained. They kept to themselves. They distrusted outsiders. They avoided drawing attention. When asked about their heritage, they shrugged, changed the subject, or laughed nervously. You know families like this. Every town has them. Every lineage that avoids certain questions is keeping an invisible ledger. And here lies the darker truth. The ledger was not just about teeth. It was about continuity. Each missing tooth recorded a silence that did not end with one body. It multiplied across generations. The mother who buried her child without answers taught her other children not to ask. The father who lost a brother but never spoke of it passed that refusal to his son. Every silence replicated itself until an entire community became fluent in erasure. Do you see the design? This was not random horror. It was a system of inheritance. Families did not need to be told to obey. They learned it in their bones. And when silence becomes inheritance, then it becomes bloodline. Entire genealogies become carriers of a contract older than their memory. Now look at your own family. Think about the stories you were never told, the gaps in your genealogy, the secrets avoided at the dinner table, the silences that weigh heavier than words. Do you think they are accidents, or are they proof that silence breeds itself, generation after generation, until you are bound by a contract you never signed, but still obey? The four sisters were not aberrations. They were custodians of a truth that every family hides. Silence can be passed down like land, like wealth, like sin, and the more it is inherited, the stronger it becomes. The genealogy of silence did not end in Vermont. It spreads wherever families hush themselves into obedience. It spreads wherever records vanish, wherever questions are punished, wherever secrets are told in whispers instead of being spoken aloud. And if silence itself is the inheritance, then the real question is this: what have you inherited? Whose silence lives in your blood? And how much of it has already been written into the ledger with your name beside it? Silence is not empty. It is weight. It presses down on the body, burrows into the mind, reshapes the soul until you no longer know where you end and the silence begins. This is what the four sisters perfected. And this is what inheritance does to those who follow. Imagine growing up in a family that refuses to answer. You ask about your grandfather's past. Silence. You ask about the strange story whispered by neighbors. Silence. You ask why your lineage feels incomplete, why photographs are missing, why records don't exist. Silence. At first, you think it is forgetfulness. Then you realize it is deliberate. And in that realization comes the first wound. The wound of being taught that some truths are not for you. That wound deepens as you age. Silence becomes second nature. You stop asking questions. You stop telling stories. You learn to censor yourself before you speak. You learn to smile when others press too far, to laugh off the discomfort, to say, "Oh, it doesn't matter." But it does matter. Every silence carved into you is another tooth pulled from your mouth, another entry in a ledger you didn't even know you were paying into. This is the psychological economy of silence. It starves identity. You think you are protecting yourself, protecting your family, protecting tradition, but in truth, you are giving pieces of yourself away, your history, your voice, your courage. Bit by bit, you become a vessel not for life, but for absence. You carry silence as if it were your true inheritance. The sisters knew this. They did not need to silence their neighbors with threats. The villagers silenced themselves. That is the deepest form of control, when obedience feels like choice, when erasure feels like safety, when the cage is invisible, and yet you carry its key in your own pocket. And here lies the most dangerous truth of all: silence is contagious. One person's refusal becomes another's. A family's avoidance becomes a community's law. Entire towns learn to breathe shallow, to speak less, to erase themselves so completely that they no longer need a four sisters watching from the farmhouse ridge. The ledger is written without their presence. It is written by you. Think about the things you have never spoken, the memories you've tucked away, the secrets you've held because to say them would mean rupture. Those silences have shaped you. They have cost you. They have carved you into a shape you did not choose. And still, you carry them forward, like a torch that burns without flame. This is the cost of inheritance, to become the vessel of contracts you never agreed to serve a system you never saw, yet one that lives in your mouth, in your memory, in your refusal to speak. The four sisters may have vanished into fire, but their greatest lesson endures. Silence is stronger than blood, and once it is in you, it does not let go easily. The farmhouse is gone, the valley is silent. The four sisters themselves have vanished into fire and rumor, but the ledger never stayed buried. For more than a century, fragments of its trail resurface. In the 1920s, a private collector in Boston claimed to own a book that bled when opened. He died suddenly, his estate auctioned, but the book was never listed in the catalogue. In 1957, a graduate student in Vermont mentioned a half-burned ledger containing human names paired with dental fragments. His thesis draft was confiscated by the university, and no copy exists today. In the 1980s, a family in upstate New York claimed their barn collapsed, and in the rubble they found pages written in a hand they could not recognize, listing their own ancestors alongside small notches marked paid. How do you explain this persistence? How does a book that should have burned, a book no one dares display, a book no library will claim, how does it keep appearing? Unless it is not an artifact at all, but a living system, one that moves where silence protects it. Even now there are whispers. People who claim to have touched it say the pages are heavier than paper should be, as if enamel were ground into pulp. Others say when you close it, the air thickens, your ears fill with pressure, and for hours afterward, every conversation feels muffled, as though your own voice is being siphoned away. One man swore the names inside shifted when no one was looking. That new names appeared, names of the living. This is where history and horror converge, because if the ledger still exists, it is not finished, it is still gathering. It does not need the Four Sisters anymore. It does not need a farmhouse or a valley. It needs only silence. Every erased record, every unanswered question, every voice that breaks but does not speak, all of it flows into the same book, as if the world itself has become its parish. And here is the darkest possibility. Perhaps you are already inside it. Perhaps your family's silences, the stories that were never told to you, the secrets carried forward without explanation. Perhaps they were not just accidents of memory. Perhaps they were entries. Your bloodline already marked, your silence already tallied. Do you understand what this means? The ledger is not myth, it is method. A ritual technology disguised as history, moving invisibly across generations, harvesting silence wherever it can be found. And as long as silence is obeyed, the ledger is fed. The Four Sisters may be gone, but the system they served thrives, and if their book still glows in hidden collections, then it is not finished writing. Which means the only question that remains is this: when your silence is tallied, what will it say beside your name? Gift or payment? This is where the story ends, and where it begins again. The Ledger of the Four Sisters was never just a book. It was a mirror. Every silence reflected back, every voice swallowed whole, every question left unasked, all of it inscribed in neat handwriting across pages that should not exist. And here you are, listening, drawn deeper with every word, pulled further into a story you were never supposed to hear. Do you understand what that means? You are already inside it. Think back. How many silences have shaped you? The secrets your family would not share, the memories your community pushed away, the history your country told in half-truths and omissions, each one another tooth pulled from the jaw of truth. Each one another entry in a ledger you never saw, but that has always been written in your name. The Four Sisters knew that silence is the purest form of obedience. They knew that a body without teeth cannot speak, a family without memory cannot resist, a nation without history cannot rebel. And they knew that those who benefit from silence will always protect it, always feed it, always weaponize it against those too afraid to break it. That is why their farmhouse was erased. That is why officials looked away. That is why the ledger still breathes. But here is the secret no one tells you. The ledger is not invincible. Silence is powerful, but it can be shattered. The sisters could only collect what was surrendered. They could only bind what was given. To speak, even in defiance, even in whispers, is to break the chain. To name what was hidden is to starve what feeds on silence. So now the choice is yours. You can leave this story as another curiosity, another horror to tuck away in the dark, another silence you add to the ledger. Or you can act, speak, break the ritual, declare in the open what so many before you swallowed whole. Type it in the comments, no, W twice, so it cannot be erased. I will not feed the ledger. Do not underestimate this act. Every word you speak, every truth you write, every silence you refuse to obey is a tooth the ledger cannot take from you. This is how you cut yourself free. This is how you ensure your name does not appear in handwriting you do not recognize. The sisters' light burned on a ridge in Vermont in 1854. Tonight, the glow is here, flickering on your screen. Their ledger still waits, still hungry, still reaching for silence to feed it. But if you have listened